My dear brothers and sisters in Christ, there was a young woman who went to see her rabbi shortly before she was going to be married in order for him to give her some counseling. And in their conversation, the young woman mentioned that she hoped that she would do a better job raising children, if she had some, than her parents did with her. And the rabbi asked for her to explain. And she said that every summer her wealthy parents would go on a vacation to Europe, and they would leave her in the company of a housekeeper. And one year, when she was 11 years old, her parents had made their usual plans, and right at that very moment, the housekeeper quit her job. And so the parents were in a frenzy what they were going to do, if they were going to have to cancel their trip. But fortunately, they were able to find a housekeeper just at the last moment. Well, a few days before they were going to leave for their trip, the mother started wrapping up all of the jewelry and all of the silverware in order to put it away in the safe. And the young girl asked her mother why she was doing that, since she had never done it before. And the mother replied, well, they couldn't trust the new housekeeper with the silver and the jewelry and other family valuables. And the young girl was shocked by what her parents had said to her, for the young girl reflected to herself, wasn't she a family valuable, and wasn't she more valuable than the silver forks and the silver knives that her mother was putting away in the safe? Well, today on this feast of the Holy Family, I think it's a good time to ask ourselves the question, how much do we value the relationships that we have with one another in a family? How much do parents value the relationship they have with their children? How much do children value the relationship they have with their parents? And how much do we value our relationships as brothers and sisters, the relationships that we have as siblings? And it's also important to reflect on the relationships that children and parents have with grandparents as well. We should treasure one another and love one another, for there are no closer bonds than the bonds of family. And today's first reading from the book of Sirach has us reflect on the fourth commandment, honor your mother and father. And what the book of Sirach says is that whoever honors his father atones for his sins. Whoever honors his father, when he prays, he will have his prayer heard. And whoever reveres his mother stores up riches. And those who honor their parents, honor their mother and father, they are going to be gladdened by children and will live a long life. All of these promises come to us if we follow this one commandment, the fourth commandment of honoring our parents and loving our parents. But the book of Sirach also reminds us that we don't outgrow the love that we have for our parents once we become adults ourselves. But this continues even when we are adults. For the book of Sirach says, and when your father grows old, continue to revere him. And even if his mind fail, be considerate to him. And so it's important that this relationship that we have as members of a family, that we continue to cultivate them through our whole lives. St. Paul, in his letter to the Colossians, he puts certain qualities, certain virtues before us, the virtues that should be cultivated in a family. And he says these are the ones that he recommends: compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. We all know what kind of patience that we need to have sometimes with our brothers and sisters, or even with our parents or our children. One of the important virtues. And then he recommends certain attitudes: bearing with one another, forgiving one another, letting our hearts be at peace with one another, letting the peace of Christ control our hearts, and being thankful, having a sense of gratitude for what members of our families do for us and for what we do for them. But he says, above everything else, put on love. Love is that essential quality that we need to have as members of a family, loving one another, loving our brothers and sisters, loving our parents, loving our children, having the love of Christ live in our hearts and showing that love towards the members of our families. And that's what we see in the Holy Family. In the Holy Family of Jesus, Mary, and Joseph. We see how Mary and Joseph assumed their responsibilities in raising Jesus, this son that had been given to them. And we hear that Jesus was obedient to them, growing in wisdom and favor before God and man, meaning that even as the Son of God, he had to be obedient to his human parents, to his parents here on earth, his earthly parents. Jesus grew in wisdom because he was obedient. And that doesn't mean that the Holy Family didn't have problems. They had problems like every family. We know that when Jesus was still a baby, the family had to flee from their native land, and they had to go to a foreign country. And fortunately, there wasn't a border wall, but they were able to go into Egypt. And Egypt welcomed them. And we don't know how long they stayed there, but they stayed until Herod had died and then returned to Nazareth to live. And we also hear that at 12 years old, because this was a family that followed all the Jewish customs and all that their faith required of them, we hear that at 12 years old, every year, this family would make a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. From Nazareth, 100 miles away, they'd travel to Jerusalem to fulfill their sacred obligations of going to the temple on a yearly basis. And how they even lost that child for 3 days because they thought, first, that the mother thought that he was with the father thought he was with the mother, and they left him behind, and they came looking for him after 3 days. And we hear of this conversation that they had, the mother saying, "Why have you done this to us? Don't you know that we're very anxious about you?" And Jesus' reply was, "Why did you worry about me? Did you not know that I must be about my Father's business?" And the gospel says that they didn't understand what he said to them at that moment. So even in the Holy Family, there was a misunderstanding of what they were saying to one another. But that didn't mean that they stopped loving one another. That love was always there, even when they didn't understand everything that was being said. Well, there was a man who was a carpenter who one day on his way to work had a flat tire. But that wasn't the end of his troubles. When he got to work, his saw broke down and he wasn't able to work that day. And at the end of the day, when he was ready to go home, his truck wouldn't start. And so he had to ask his boss for a ride home. And all the way home, he was fuming because of all the troubles he had that day. And finally, when they arrived at the house, the carpenter invited the boss to come in and meet his family. As they were walking towards the house, the carpenter stopped at a pine tree, a huge pine tree that was in the yard, and he grabbed hold of the bottom branches with both hands. And then they went into the house. And once they got into the house, there was a complete transformation. The man, the father, was all smiles and hugs for his two small children. Then he embraced his wife and he kissed his wife. And they had a wonderful little visit. And the carpenter walked his boss back to the truck. And as they were walking back, the boss was a little curious about the little ritual that the man had made at the pine tree. And so he asked him about it. And the man explained, he said, "That's my trouble tree." He says, "Sometimes when I have troubles and frustrations at work," he says, "I don't want to bring those into the house. And so what I do is I go to this pine tree and I hang them up on that trouble tree." He says, "That's my trouble tree. And I hang them up there before going into the house." He says, and it's a strange thing. He says, the next morning as I come out to go and pick up my troubles and my frustrations and worries, I find that they're not as big as I thought they were when I hung them up there, and certainly not as many as they were. What a great attitude. When you are there with your family, be there with all your love and all your care and all your compassion. Today, on this feast of the Holy Family, Jesus, Mary, and Joseph, let us ask that the same kind of love that reigned in that household will reign in our household because of our faith and because of our devotion to our God. May the love of Christ reign in our hearts, reign in our homes, and reign in our families.